Hey guys, tonight we're diving into the strange and often exhausting kitchen rules that millions of American housewives were expected to follow during their 1950s. Before we begin, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, grab a cozy blanket, and settle in for another relaxing journey into history. Imagine waking up in a quiet American suburb in 1955. The sun has barely risen, yet your day has already begun. The first thing expected of you is not relaxation or personal time. Instead, you are expected to think about breakfast, lunch, dinner, and every detail in between. In the eyes of society, a successful woman was judged by the condition of her home and especially by the condition of her kitchen. A spotless kitchen was considered proof of good character. Magazine articles instructed women to wipe counters several times a day, polish appliances until they shined, and ensure that not a single dirty dish remained visible when guests arrived. Even a small amount of clutter could be seen as a sign of laziness. The pressure was constant. Advertisements showed smiling women standing beside sparkling stoves and perfectly organized cabinets. These images suggested that maintaining such perfection was easy, even though real life was far more demanding. Every meal carried its own expectations. Husbands returning from work were often expected to find dinner ready and waiting on the table. Cookbooks and women's magazines advised wives to plan meals carefully and to avoid repeating dishes too often. Meat was considered an essential part of a proper dinner, and serving inexpensive alternatives could sometimes be viewed as a failure to provide for the family. Women spent hours comparing recipes, shopping for ingredients, and preparing food from scratch. Convenience foods were becoming popular, but there was a strange contradiction. Companies promoted canned soups, frozen dinners, and packaged desserts as symbols of modern progress. Yet many women feared being judged if they relied on them too heavily. A good housewife was expected to embrace modern technology while still demonstrating impressive cooking skills. The kitchen itself became a stage where women were expected to perform competence every day. Guests might inspect cupboards, notice dusty shelves, or quietly judge the arrangement of dishes. Some etiquette guides even explained the correct way to organize a freezer and the proper placement of plates and glasses during dinner parties. What seemed like simple household tasks became complicated rules that demanded time, energy, and constant attention. For many women, keeping up with these expectations felt like a full-time job, one that rarely came with recognition or rest. Yet, despite the pressure, millions followed these rules because they believed they were building a better life for their families and creating the ideal American home. Dinner parties created even more pressure. During the 1950s, inviting neighbors, co-workers, or relatives into your home was not simply a social activity. It was often viewed as a public test of your abilities. Women spent days preparing for these events. Tables were decorated with matching dishes, polished silverware, and carefully folded napkins. The meal had to be impressive but not wasteful. The desserts had to look elegant but not overly extravagant. Even the way a hostess greeted guests was discussed in magazines and etiquette books. Many women worried constantly about making mistakes because they feared criticism from friends and neighbours. Some households kept special dishes that were only used when company arrived. These items remained hidden for most of the year, waiting for the moment when the family needed to make a perfect impression. The pressure extended beyond food and decorations. Children were expected to behave properly, speak politely, and remain clean throughout the evening. Husbands were expected to appear successful and respectable. In more ways, the dinner party became a performance in which every family member had a role. The kitchen was the centre of that performance. It was not unusual for a woman to spend the entire day cooking, cleaning, and organising before guests arrived. After everyone left, she often faced several more hours of washing dishes and restoring the house to perfect order. Television added another layer of expectation. Popular programmes frequently portrayed cheerful wives who handled every household responsibility with ease. These fictional characters rarely appeared tired or frustrated. They seemed to enjoy every moment of cleaning, cooking, and caring for others. Real women compared themselves to these idealised images and often felt inadequate when their own lives failed to match what they saw on screen. Advertisers took advantage of these feelings. New kitchen appliances promised to save time and reduce effort. Refrigerators became larger, ovens became more advanced, and electric mixers appeared in homes across the country. Yet, instead of reducing expectations, these inventions often increased them, because tasks could supposedly be completed faster. Society expected women to accomplish even more. A cleaner kitchen or better meal, and a more organised home became the new standard. The result was a cycle that never seemed to end. Many women worked from sunrise until late at night, trying to achieve a level of perfection that was almost impossible to maintain. Behind the bright advertisements and smiling photographs was a reality filled with long hours, hard work, and the constant feeling that there was always one more task waiting to be completed. As the decade continued, another unwritten rule became clear. A housewife was expected to place the needs of everyone else before her own. Many women woke up early to prepare breakfast, packed lunches for children, cleaned the house during the day, and then prepared dinner in the evening. Personal hobbies and free time were often considered less important than household responsibilities. Advice columns regularly encouraged women to remain cheerful no matter how difficult their day had been. Some articles even suggested that husbands should never come home to complaints or signs of frustration. Instead, wives were encouraged to greet them with a smile and create a peaceful atmosphere after work. This expectation placed a heavy emotional burden on many women. They were expected not only to manage the household, but also to maintain the happiness of everyone around them. The kitchen became one of the places where this burden was most visible. A burnt meal, an unwashed sink, or an empty pantry could feel like a personal failure. Grocery shopping itself was a complicated task. Families often lived on strict budgets, and women were expected to stretch every dollar as far as possible. They carefully compared prices, collected coupons, and planned meals days in advance. Waste was discouraged. Leftovers were transformed into new meals, and creative recipes were developed to make ingredients last longer. At the same time, Mothers faced growing pressure to provide nutritious meals. Experts warned about vitamins, minerals, and balanced diets. Women were told that the health of their children depended largely on what happened in the kitchen. As a result, many spent hours studying recipes and nutritional advice. Yet despite all this effort, recognition was often limited. Household work was frequently viewed as something that simply needed to be done, rather than as a skill requiring dedication and expertise. Visitors admired the finished meal but rarely saw the hours of preparation behind it. They noticed the clean kitchen, but not the endless scrubbing required. To keep it that way, for many women, the work became invisible precisely because it was expected. Day after day, they repeated the same routines, trying to meet standards that seemed to grow higher every year. While some genuinely enjoyed cooking and homemaking, others quietly wondered whether life could offer more opportunities beyond the walls of the kitchen. Those questions would slowly grow louder as the years passed, eventually helping to reshape American society in ways few people could imagine during the calm suburban days of the 1950s. By the late 1950s, small changes were beginning to appear beneath the surface of American life. The image of the perfect housewife remained powerful, but not every woman felt satisfied with the role society had chosen for her. Some had attended college before marriage. Others had dreams of careers, travel, writing, teaching, or business. Yet many found themselves spending nearly every day performing the same household routines. The contrast between their ambitions and their daily responsibilities sometimes created a quiet sense of frustration that was rarely discussed openly. Society encouraged women to believe that complete fulfillment could be found in maintaining a beautiful home and raising a family. For some, this was true. For others, the reality felt more complicated. Many women experienced loneliness during the day while their husbands worked and their children attended school. Suburban neighborhoods were often peaceful, but they could also feel isolated. Hours were spent cleaning rooms that would soon become messy again, preparing meals that disappeared within minutes, and completing tasks that would need to be repeated the following day. Despite the hard work involved, these responsibilities were often taken for granted. Newspapers celebrated businessmen, politicians, and athletes, while the efforts of homemakers rarely appeared in headlines. Yet the smooth functioning of millions of households depended on their labour. Every organised family schedule, every packed school lunch, and every carefully prepared dinner reflected countless hours of unseen effort. At the same time, consumer culture continued to expand. New products appeared constantly, each promising to create a more efficient and modern home. Women were encouraged to purchase new mixers, blenders, cookware, and cleaning supplies. Advertisements suggested that a truly successful homemaker always owned the latest equipment. This created additional pressure for families, trying to keep up with changing expectations. The definition of a perfect kitchen seemed to evolve every year. What had once been considered modern quickly became outdated. Many women found themselves caught between tradition and change, expected to preserve old values while embracing new technologies. Looking back today, it is easy to focus on the strange rules and rigid expectations of the era. But behind those rules were real, people doing their best to navigate a rapidly changing world. The kitchens of the 1950s were more than places where meals were prepared. They were spaces where hopes, responsibilities, pressures, and dreams all came together. And as the next decade approached, the quiet questions many women had been asking themselves would begin to grow into a movement that would challenge long-standing assumptions about what a woman's role in society should be. As the 1960s approached, the world outside the kitchen was beginning to change faster than ever before. New technologies, new ideas, and new opportunities were slowly reshaping American society. Yet inside many homes, the expectations placed on women remained much the same. A typical day still revolved around meals, cleaning schedules, laundry, shopping trips, and caring for family members. Many women became experts at managing households with remarkable efficiency. They knew exactly how to plan a week's worth of meals, how to make a limited budget stretch further, and how to keep a busy family organised. These skills required intelligence, discipline, and creativity, even if society did not always recognise them as valuable talents. Some women developed detailed systems for managing every part of the household. Recipe cards were carefully organised. Grocery lists were prepared days in advance. Cleaning schedules divided tasks across the week to ensure nothing was forgotten. The kitchen often operated almost like a small business, with budgets, inventories, planning, and constant problem solving. Yet despite the complexity of this work, it was often described as simple or natural, as though it required no special effort. This attitude prevented many people from appreciating just how demanding homemaking could be. During this period, magazines continued to publish endless advice about becoming a better wife and mother. Readers were told how to arrange furniture, how to decorate kitchens, how to prepare attractive meals, and even how to speak during social gatherings. The message was clear. There was always room for improvement, no matter how much work a woman completed. Another article or advertisement would suggest an even higher standard. For some, this created a feeling that perfection was always just out of reach. Nevertheless, many families looked back on these years with fond memories. Children remembered the smell of fresh meals coming from the kitchen after school. Families gathered around dinner tables each evening to share stories about their day. Holiday meals brought relatives together and created traditions that would last for generations. Behind many of those cherished memories stood women whose efforts helped make them possible. Their work may not have received public awards or newspaper headlines, but it shaped daily life in countless homes across America as the nation moved toward a new decade filled with social change. The role of the housewife would begin to evolve. But before that transformation arrived, millions of women continued to wake each morning, step into their kitchens, and carry out responsibilities. That had become the foundation of family life. Throughout the 1950s, the changes that arrived in the 1960s did not happen overnight. For a long time, the expectations of the previous decade continued to influence daily life. Many women still followed routines that would have been familiar to a housewife in 1950. Breakfast was prepared before the family woke up. Floors were swept, beds were made, and shopping trips were carefully planned. Yet, beneath these familiar routines, attitudes were slowly beginning to shift. More women started discussing experiences that had previously remained private. Conversations with friends, neighbours, and relatives revealed that many shared the same feelings of exhaustion, pressure, and uncertainty. The realization that these concerns were common brought comfort to some and inspiration to others. It became increasingly difficult to maintain the idea that every housewife was perfectly happy all the time. Books, newspapers, and television programs gradually began addressing topics that had once been avoided. Questions emerged about education, employment, and personal independence. Women who had spent years focusing entirely on household responsibilities started imagining different possibilities for their futures. Some returned to school. Others pursued part-time jobs or volunteer work. These decisions were not always easy. In many communities, traditional expectations remained strong, and stepping outside established roles could attract criticism. Even so, change continued moving forward. Interestingly, the kitchen remained at the centre of many of these developments. New appliances became more common, reducing the time required for certain tasks. Dishwashers, improved washing machines, and modern ovens helped simplify some household duties. While these inventions did not eliminate work completely, they gave many women additional time that previous generations had never enjoyed. For some, this extra time created opportunities to explore interests beyond homemaking. For others, it simply provided a chance to rest. Looking back today, it is important to remember that the story of the 1950s housewife is not only a story about restrictions and expectations. It is also a story about resilience. Millions of women managed households, raised children, supported families, balanced budgets, and solved countless daily problems. They performed work that demanded patience, organisation, and dedication. Although history often focuses on famous leaders and major events, ordinary people shape society in powerful ways. The women standing in those bright suburban kitchens helped define an era. Their efforts influenced family traditions, community life, and the experiences of an entire generation of children. The world around them would continue changing rapidly, but the legacy of their daily work would remain visible long after. The polished countertops, recipe books, and shiny appliances of the 1950s had faded into history. By the end of the 1960s, America looked very different from the country that had celebrated the ideal housewife at the beginning of the previous decade. Many of the strict expectations that once dominated everyday life were being questioned. Women increasingly entered colleges, workplaces, and professions that had previously been difficult to access. Yet, even as society changed, many of the habits and traditions of the 1950s remained. Family dinners continued to bring people together. Favourite recipes were passed from mothers to daughters. Holiday meals still centred around dishes that had become popular years earlier. In countless homes, the influence of the 1950s kitchen lived on. Some women looked back on those years with pride. They remembered creating warm homes, caring for loved ones, and building strong family traditions. Others remembered the pressure, the endless responsibilities, and the feeling that their choices had been limited by social expectations. For most, the truth existed somewhere between these two perspectives. Life was neither completely perfect nor completely miserable. It was a complicated mixture of satisfaction, sacrifice, joy, and hard work. The famous advertisements of the era often showed smiling women standing beside, spotless stoves. But real life was far more complex than any advertisement could capture. Behind every polished kitchen stood a person balancing dozens of responsibilities each day. Many women became masters of organisation, capable of managing budgets, schedules, meals, childcare, and household maintenance all at the same time. These achievements rarely received public recognition, but they required remarkable skill and determination. Historians today often study political events, economic changes, and technological developments. But the everyday experiences of ordinary families are equally important. The kitchen was where many of those experiences unfolded. It was where children learned family traditions, where celebrations were planned, where problems were discussed, and where daily life quietly continued regardless of what was happening in the wider world. In many ways, the story of the 1950s housewife is really the story of ordinary people doing extraordinary amounts of unseen work. Their efforts helped shape neighbourhoods, communities, and future generations. While modern life is very different in many respects, the desire to create a comfortable home, share meals with loved ones, and care for family remains familiar even today. The tools have changed, the expectations have evolved, and society has moved forward. But the human values at the heart of these kitchens continue to connect the present with the past. And so, as we leave behind the bright appliances, recipe books, and carefully arranged dinner tables of 1950s America, we are reminded that history is often found not only in famous events, but also in the quiet routines of everyday life. Yet, even after society changed, many myths about the 1950s housewife remained. Popular movies, television programs, and nostalgic memories often presented the decade as a simple and perfect time. Viewers saw beautiful homes, smiling families, and peaceful suburban streets. What these images rarely showed were the challenges hidden behind the scenes. They did not show the women waking before sunrise to prepare breakfast. They did not show the hours spent scrubbing floors, washing clothes, ironing shirts, and preparing meals. They did not show the stress of stretching, a limited budget through an entire month, or the exhaustion that came after caring for children all day. History becomes more interesting when we look beyond the polished surface and examine the reality experienced by ordinary people. In chores, the women of the 1950s lived through a period of enormous transition. They stood between older traditions and a rapidly modernising world. Many had grown up during the Great Depression or experienced the hardships of World War II. Those experiences shaped their attitudes toward work, money, family, and responsibility. Waste was avoided whenever possible. Leftovers were saved. Broken items were repaired instead of replaced. These habits followed many families into the prosperous years that came afterward. At the same time, a new culture of consumerism encouraged people to buy more products than ever before. Women found themselves balancing old values of thrift with new messages promoting endless consumption. This created contradictions that appeared throughout daily life. Advertisements encouraged families to purchase the latest appliances, while financial advice stressed careful budgeting. Women were expected to save money and spend money at the same time. They were expected to embrace modern convenience while maintaining traditional standards. Navigating these conflicting expectations required constant adjustment. Despite these challenges, many women built strong communities through neighborhood friendships, church groups, school events, and local organizations. They exchanged recipes, shared advice, watched each other's children, and supported one another during difficult times. These social networks helped many families thrive. While history often focuses on governments and famous individuals, communities are built by ordinary people working together. The friendships formed across kitchen tables and backyard fences became an important part of everyday life. As the decades passed, many former housewives would look back on their experiences with mixed emotions. Some remembered the joy of raising children and creating family traditions. Others remembered opportunities they wished they had been given. Most carried both feelings at once. Their lives remind us that history is rarely simple. Every era contains both advantages and disadvantages, freedoms and limitations, successes and sacrifices. As historians look back on the kitchens of the 1950s, they often see something much larger than recipes and household chores. They see a window into the values of an entire society. The kitchen reflected ideas about family, success, responsibility, and gender roles. It was a place where social expectations became part of everyday life. Every polished countertop, every carefully planned meal, and every family gathering told a story about what people believed a good life should look like. For many families, the kitchen was the heart of the home. It was where children completed homework while their mothers prepared dinner. It was where families discussed school, work, finances, and future plans. It was where birthdays were celebrated and holiday. Traditions were passed from one generation to the next, long before smartphones and social media. Much of family life happened around a kitchen table. These moments created memories that lasted for decades. Even people who later questioned the strict expectations of the era often remembered these gatherings with affection, the warmth of a shared meal and the comfort of familiar routines became powerful parts of family identity. Yet the same space that created comfort could also create pressure. A woman who failed to meet society's standards sometimes felt she was failing her family, even when those standards were unrealistic. The expectation of perfection left little room for mistakes. A messy room, a poorly prepared meal, or a missed household task could cause embarrassment or guilt. Looking back today, it becomes clear that no one could realistically maintain perfection every day. The ideal presented in advertisements was largely an illusion. Real homes were sometimes messy. Real meals occasionally burned. Real families faced disagreements, stress, and uncertainty. Understanding this reality helps us see the people of the past as human beings rather than perfect images frozen in old photographs. Perhaps one of the most important lessons from this history is that ordinary work matters. The tasks performed by millions of housewives were often overlooked because they happened behind closed doors. Yet these efforts shaped daily life for entire communities. Children grew up in homes made possible by this labour. Families depended on it. Neighbourhoods depended on it. Society itself depended on it. While history books may focus on presidents, wars, and major inventions, everyday life is built by countless small actions repeated day after day. The women of the 1950s understood this reality better than most. Whether they loved their role, struggled with it, or experienced a mixture of both, their work left a lasting impact that can still be felt today. Their story reminds us that history is not only made by famous people, it is also made by ordinary individuals, whose quiet efforts help shape the world around them. And perhaps that is why the story of the 1950s, Housewife, continues to fascinate people today. It is not simply a story about cooking, cleaning, or household rules. It is a story about expectations. Every generation creates ideas about how people should live, what success looks like, and which responsibilities matter most. The women of the 1950s lived within a system that praised devotion to home and family above almost everything else. Many embraced those values sincerely. Others quietly questioned them. Most simply did their best to navigate the circumstances they were given. When we study their lives, we gain a better understanding of how society changes over time. Ideas that once seemed completely normal can eventually appear strange to future generations. In the 1950s, few people imagined how dramatically family life would evolve over the coming decades. Careers that were uncommon for women would become ordinary. Educational opportunities would expand. Household technology would continue improving. Roles that once seemed fixed would become more flexible. Yet despite all these changes, certain challenges remained surprisingly familiar. Families still worried about finances. Parents still wanted the best for their children. People still searched for balance between work, responsibility, and personal happiness. The details changed, but many human concerns remained the same. This is one reason history feels so relatable. Even when lifestyles appear different, the emotions behind them are often recognizable. The women standing in those bright kitchens experienced hope, stress, pride, disappointment, ambition, love, and uncertainty just as people do today. Their appliances may seem old-fashioned now, and some of their social rules may appear outdated, but their lives were filled with the same complicated emotions that shape every generation. Looking carefully at the past also helps us appreciate progress. Many opportunities available today exist because previous generations questioned old assumptions and pushed for change. At the same time, history reminds us that every era comes with its own expectations and pressures. Future generations may one day look back at our own time with the same curiosity that we bring to the 1950s. They may wonder why we lived the way we did, followed certain trends, or accepted particular social norms. In Setzenze Zamura, by studying the past, we learn something about ourselves. The story of the American housewife is not only about one group of women in one specific decade. It is about the relationship between individuals and society, between personal dreams and cultural expectations. It shows how ordinary lives can reveal extraordinary truths about an entire era. And as we continue our journey through history, we discover that some of the most important stories are often found not in palaces or government buildings, but in the everyday places where ordinary people quietly lived their lives. As the 20th century moved further into the past, many of the kitchens that once represented the American dream slowly disappeared. Old appliances were replaced, houses were remodeled, and entire neighbourhoods changed. Yet photographs from the era still survive. In these images, we often see smiling families gathered around dinner tables, children helping bake cookies, and mothers standing beside carefully prepared meals. At first glance, the pictures appear simple, but every photograph contains a deeper story. Behind each image was a person with hopes, worries, strengths, and challenges that were rarely visible to the camera. The photographs captured a moment, but not the countless hours of work that made that moment possible. Historians often rely on these images along with diaries, letters, advertisements, and interviews to understand what daily life was really like. When they look closely, they discover a world that was far more complicated than popular. Stereotypes suggest not every family matched the ideal presented in magazines. Some struggled financially. Others faced illness, family disagreements, or personal hardships. Many women balanced enormous responsibilities while receiving little recognition. Yet despite these difficulties, people continued building lives, raising children, and creating memories. That ability to continue, moving forward through ordinary challenges, is one of the most remarkable aspects of human history. The story of the 1950s kitchen is ultimately a story of adaptation. Families adapted to changing economic conditions. Women adapted to social expectations. Communities adapted to new technologies and cultural shifts. Every generation faces its own version of these challenges. The details may differ, but the process remains familiar. People adjust, learn, compromise, and find ways to make life work. This is why the experiences of ordinary individuals remain so important to historians. They reveal how large social changes are actually lived by real people. Major events may shape a nation, but everyday decisions shape daily life. A mother planning meals, a family gathering for dinner, a neighbour sharing a recipe, or a child helping set the table may seem like small moments, yet millions of such moments combined to create the culture of an entire era. When we study history through these everyday experiences, the past becomes more human and more understandable. We begin to see that historical change is not only driven by famous leaders or dramatic events, it is also driven by ordinary people making choices within the circumstances of their time. The women who spent their days in 1950s kitchens may never have imagined that future. Generations would study their lives. Yet their experiences continue to teach us valuable lessons about family, work, expectations, and the ever-changing relationship between society and the individual. Eventually, the generation that had grown up in those kitchens began sharing their memories with children and grandchildren. Some stories were told with laughter. Others were told with a sense of disbelief at how different life had once been. Grandchildren listened as grandparents described a world without smartphones, internet shopping, or microwave ovens. They heard about handwritten grocery lists, recipe boxes filled with index cards, and family dinners that brought everyone together at the same table nearly every evening. To younger generations, these routines often sounded unusual, yet they also carried a certain sense of warmth and familiarity. The kitchen was more than a place to prepare food. It was a place where knowledge was passed down from one generation to another. Mothers taught daughters family recipes. Grandmothers shared cooking techniques learned decades earlier. Holiday traditions survived because someone took the time to teach them. In this way, the kitchen became a bridge connecting the past with the future. Even as society changed, many of these traditions continued. Some recipes that were popular in the 1950s are still prepared today, especially during family gatherings and celebrations. The ingredients may have changed slightly, but the memories attached to them remain powerful. Food has a unique ability to preserve history. A single smell or taste can bring back memories that have been dormant for years. For many families, the kitchen became one of the strongest links to their personal past. At the same time, historians have become increasingly interested in understanding the experiences of ordinary women whose contributions were often overlooked. For many years, historical books focused primarily on political leaders, military conflicts, and major economic events. Gradually, researchers began paying more attention to daily life. They realized that understanding a society requires understanding how ordinary people lived. The experiences of housewives became an important part of that story. Through interviews, letters, diaries, and personal records, historians gained a clearer picture of what life was actually like behind the polished images shown in advertisements. These sources revealed both the rewards and challenges of homemaking. They showed women finding pride in caring for their families while also facing pressures that could be exhausting and restrictive. The result is a more balanced understanding of the era, rather than seeing the 1950s as either a perfect golden age or a period of constant hardship. We can recognize it as a complex time filled with both opportunities and limitations. Like every period in history, it contained successes, struggles, dreams, and disappointments. The people who lived through it were not symbols or stereotypes. They were individuals navigating the realities of their world, doing the best they could with the choices available to them. And perhaps that human reality is what makes their story continue to resonate so strongly today. As we move toward the final years of this story, it becomes clear that the legacy of the 1950s housewife cannot be measured simply by household chores or social expectations. The true legacy lies in the countless lives that were shaped inside those homes. Children learned manners, responsibility, and family traditions around kitchen tables. Parents made difficult decisions about money, education, and the future while sharing evening meals. Families celebrated victories, comforted one another during hardships, and created memories that would last a lifetime. The kitchen often served as the setting for these important moments, while newspapers focused on national events and world leaders. Much of real life unfolded quietly inside ordinary homes. This reminds us that history exists on many different levels. There is the history found in governments, wars, and major inventions. But there is also the history found in everyday routines. Both are important because together they tell the complete story of a society. The women of the 1950s contributed to that story in ways that were often invisible at the time. They organised households, cared for children, managed finances, prepared meals, and maintained the daily stability that families depended upon. Their efforts created the foundation upon which many future opportunities were built. As decades passed, attitudes toward family roles continued to evolve. New generations made different choices and followed different paths. Yet many values associated with the 1950s remained influential. Ideas about family connection, hospitality, responsibility, and caring for loved ones continued to be passed down. Even people who rejected some of the era's strict expectations often preserved traditions that had originated during those years. In Sisve, the past continued influencing the present long after the decade itself had ended. Looking back now, we can appreciate both the strengths and weaknesses of that world. We can admire the dedication and resilience shown by many women, while also recognizing the limitations they sometimes faced. History becomes most valuable when we resist simple judgments and instead seek understanding. The people of the past were navigating challenges that felt just as real and important to them as our challenges feel to us today. They lived in a different world, but they shared many of the same hopes that people continue to have now: security, happiness, purpose, and a better future for their families. These universal desires connect us across generations. When we study the lives of ordinary people, we discover that the distance between past and present is often smaller than it first appears. The kitchens may look different, the technology may have changed, and social expectations may have evolved, but the human experience remains surprisingly familiar, and that enduring connection is one of the reasons why the story of the 1950s housewife continues to capture our imagination even many decades later. Perhaps the most surprising thing about the story of the 1950s housewife is how quickly the world changed afterward. Many women who spent their early adult years following strict household expectations lived long enough to witness extraordinary transformations. They saw people walk on the moon. They watched television evolve from a luxury into an everyday necessity. They experienced the arrival of personal computers, mobile phone internet. The kitchens that once represented the height of modern technology gradually became reminders of a different era. Appliances that had once seemed revolutionary eventually appeared old-fashioned. Yet the memories connected to those spaces remained powerful. For many families, the kitchen was never really about the appliances or the furniture. It was about the people gathered inside. A simple dinner could become a cherished memory decades later. A family recipe could survive long after the person who created it was gone. These small moments often outlast the larger events that dominate headlines. This is one reason historians pay increasing attention to everyday life. Ordinary experiences help us understand how people actually lived, rather than how advertisements claimed they lived. When we look closely, we discover that the 1950s were filled with contradictions. It was a decade of prosperity for many families, Yet financial worries still existed. It celebrated domestic life. Yet many women quietly wished for greater opportunities. It promoted modern technology, yet remained attached to traditional social expectations. These contradictions make the era fascinating because real life is rarely simple. People often hold competing beliefs at the same time. They adapt to changing circumstances while trying to preserve familiar traditions. The women of the 1950s did exactly that. They balanced old values with a rapidly changing world, creating lives that were far more complex than the cheerful images found in magazines. Today, when people imagine the decade, they often picture neat suburban homes, classic automobiles, and spotless kitchens. Those images are not entirely wrong, but they tell only part of the story. The complete story includes hard work, sacrifice, resilience, uncertainty, and personal ambition. It includes moments of happiness alongside moments of frustration. Most importantly, it includes millions of individuals whose experiences differed from one household to another. No single image can fully capture such a diverse reality. That is why studying history requires looking beyond stereotypes and examining the lives of real people. The closer we look, the more human the past becomes. We stop seeing symbols and begin seeing individuals with dreams, fears, strengths, and weaknesses. And in doing so, we often discover reflections of ourselves within their stories, even across the distance of many decades. By the time the 20th century came to a close, the world that had produced the classic 1950s, Housewife, seemed almost unrecognizable. Families lived differently, worked differently, and communicated differently. Yet traces of that era could still be found everywhere. Many people continued using recipes passed down from mothers and grandmothers. Family traditions established decades earlier remained part of holiday celebrations. Even the design of modern kitchens reflected ideas that had become popular during the post-war years. History rarely disappears completely. Instead, pieces of it remain woven into everyday life, often in ways we barely notice. This is especially true when it comes to family traditions. A recipe written on a faded card, a particular way of setting the dinner table, or a favourite holiday meal can carry the influence of generations. The women who spent countless hours in their kitchens during the 1950 Sekunde may never have imagined how long their influence would last. Yet through habits, traditions, and memories, their impact continued long after the decade itself had ended. At the same time, modern historians have become increasingly interested in giving these women the recognition they deserve. For many years, household labour was often overlooked because it did not generate headlines or political debates. Today, researchers understand that caring for families, managing homes, and maintaining communities are essential parts of understanding any society. Without that work, daily life could not function. The story of the housewife is therefore not a small story. It is a story about millions of people whose efforts quietly supported entire communities. Labak. It is easy to focus on the unusual rules and expectations that seem strange today. We may wonder why society placed so much pressure on women to maintain perfect homes, or why certain roles were considered mandatory. but every era has beliefs that future generations will find surprising. The people of the 1950s were simply living according to their values and assumptions of their time. Just as we are shaped by our own cultural expectations, they were shaped by theirs. Understanding this helps us approach history with empathy rather than judgment. It reminds us that people in the past were not fundamentally different from us. They wanted security, happiness, respect, and meaningful lives. They faced challenges, made missteps change, and hoped for a better future. In the end, the story of the American housewife is not merely about kitchens, recipes, or household chores. It is about human resilience. It is about the ability to create comfort and stability in an uncertain world. It is about the countless, ordinary acts of care that often go unnoticed but help shape generations. And as we continue exploring the past, we discover that some of history's most powerful stories are found not in grand palaces or famous battlefields, but in the everyday homes where ordinary people quietly built their lives. As our journey through the kitchens of 1950s, America slowly approaches its conclusion, one final question remains. What can we learn from these women today? The answer is not found in old recipes or cleaning schedules alone. It is found in understanding the value of everyday effort. Modern society often celebrates dramatic achievements, famous individuals, and major historical events. Yet the lives of ordinary people are equally important. The housewives of the 1950s rarely appeared on television, rarely gave public speeches, and rarely became famous. Nevertheless, their daily actions shaped the lives of millions. They raised children who would become teachers, doctors, engineers, business owners, artists, and leaders. They maintained homes that provided stability during times of social and economic change. They preserved traditions that connected generations. Their contributions may have been quiet, but they were far from insignificant. In many ways, their story reminds us that history is built from countless small actions repeated over time. A meal prepared for a family, a lesson taught to a child, a budget carefully managed, or a comforting conversation at the end of a difficult day may seem ordinary. Yet these moments influence lives in ways that cannot always be measured. Looking at the past also encourages us to think more carefully about the expectations we place on people today. Every generation creates ideals that seem normal in the moment. The perfect worker, the perfect parent, the perfect student, or the perfect lifestyle often appears in advertisements and social media just as the perfect housewife appeared in magazines during the 1950s, but perfection remains as unrealistic now as it was then. The experiences of these women remind us that behind every idealized image is au real, person facing real challenges. Understanding this truth allows us to approach both history and modern life with greater compassion. We begin to appreciate the effort that exists behind the scenes, even when it is not publicly recognized. Perhaps that is one of the most meaningful lessons this story offers. The work that matters most is not always the work that receives the most attention. Often, the most important contributions happen quietly, day after day, without applause or recognition. The women who spent their lives in the kitchens of 1950 Sekunden America understood this reality better than anyone. Their world may have disappeared, but the lessons it leaves behind remain relevant. Through their experiences, we gain a deeper understanding of family, responsibility, community, and the enduring importance of ordinary people in shaping history. And as the evening grows quieter and our exploration of this remarkable era continues, we can take a moment to appreciate the countless, unseen efforts that helped build the world we know today. And when we think about those unseen efforts, it becomes easier to understand why so many people remain fascinated by this period of history. The story is not really about appliances, advertisements, or household rules. It is about people trying to create order in a world that was constantly changing. Every morning, millions of women woke up with a list of responsibilities already waiting for them. Some days were enjoyable. Others were exhausting. Most were a mixture of both. Yet, regardless of how they felt, the work continued because families depended on it. This sense of responsibility became one of the defining characteristics of the era. Many women believed deeply in the importance of caring for others. They found purpose in helping their children succeed, supporting their husbands, and creating homes where family members felt safe and welcome. At the same time, these responsibilities often required personal sacrifices that were not always visible to those around them. Dreams were postponed. Ambitions were sometimes set aside. Personal time was often limited. These sacrifices became part of the hidden cost of maintaining the ideal home celebrated by society. Yet it would be unfair to view these women only through the lens of sacrifice. Many demonstrated remarkable creativity and resourcefulness. They transformed simple ingredients into meals that fed entire families. They stretched budgets during difficult times. They solved problems every day without recognition or praise. In many respects, they were managers, planners, teachers, nurses, counselors, and financial coordinators all at once. Their skills extended far beyond what traditional descriptions often suggest. Modern researchers increasingly recognize this complexity. Rather than viewing housewives as passive figures, historians now understand that they played active roles in shaping family, life, and community culture. Their decisions influenced how children were raised, how traditions were preserved, and how values were passed from one generation to the next. Through these everyday choices, they helped shape the future in ways that were impossible to see at the time. Perhaps this is why their story continues to resonate. It reminds us that influence is not always measured by public achievements. Sometimes influence is measured by the lives we touch, the people we support, and the traditions we preserve. The kitchens of the 1950s may seem distant now, but the human experiences found within them remain familiar. Love, responsibility, hope, worry, ambition, and resilience are not limited to any particular decade. They belong to every generation. And as we continue reflecting on this fascinating chapter of American history, we are reminded that behind every historical era are ordinary people doing their best to navigate the challenges of their time, leaving behind legacies far greater than they could ever have imagined. As we look deeper into the lives of these women, another important truth begins to emerge. History is often remembered through major events, but daily life is where most people actually experience history. The women of the 1950s were not thinking about how future generations would study them. They were thinking about paying bills, preparing dinner, helping children with schoolwork, and making sure the household continued running smoothly. Yet these ordinary activities became part of a much larger historical story. Each home reflected the culture, values, and expectations of its time. Through millions of small decisions made every day, an entire way of life was created. When historians examine letters and personal diaries from the period, they often find a mixture of emotions. Some women expressed pride in their homes and families. Others wrote about loneliness, frustration, or the desire for greater independence. Many experienced both feelings at different times. Human lives are rarely defined by a single emotion. Happiness and disappointment often exist side by side. The reality of the 1950s housewife was no different. Some days brought satisfaction and joy. Other days brought exhaustion and doubt. Understanding this complexity helps us move beyond simple stereotypes. The women of this era were individuals with unique personalities, goals, and experiences. They were not identical copies of the smiling figures seen in advertisements. They were real people navigating real challenges. Another interesting aspect of the period was the strong emphasis on appearances. Families often felt pressure to present an image of success to neighbours and relatives. Homes were expected to look neat. Lawns were expected to be maintained. Children were expected to behave properly. These expectations created a sense of community, but could also create anxiety. People worried about being judged by others. In many neighbourhoods, reputation mattered greatly. The desire to appear successful sometimes hid difficulties that families were experiencing behind closed doors. Financial struggles, personal disagreements, and emotional challenges often remained private. As a result, the public image of the perfect family was frequently more polished than reality itself. Yet despite these pressures, communities often provided valuable support. Neighbours helped one another during illnesses, shared advice, and offered assistance during difficult times. Friendships formed through schools, churches, and local events created networks that strengthened communities. These relationships helped many families overcome challenges that would have been difficult to face alone. Looking back now, it becomes clear that the story of the 1950s kitchen is not simply about rules or expectations. It is about people working together to build families and communities. It is about resilience in the face of daily challenges. And it is about the countless ordinary moments that quietly shaped the course of history, one meal, one conversation, and one day at a time. One reason these stories remain so powerful is because they reveal how much of life takes place in moments that rarely make it into history books. A family gathered around a dinner table may seem unimportant compared to a political election or a major invention. Yet, for the people involved, those moments often mattered far more. The conversations shared over meals helped shape beliefs, values, and relationships. Children learned how to interact with others by watching their parents. Family traditions were passed down through everyday routines. In more ways, the kitchen served as a classroom. where life lessons were taught without anyone realizing it. A child helping prepare dinner might learn responsibility. A family discussion about finances could teach the importance of planning and sacrifice. These lessons often remained with people long after they left home. The influence of the 1950s kitchen, therefore, extended far beyond the walls of the house itself. It helped shape future generations. Many adults who grew up during this period later remembered not only the meals they ate, but also the atmosphere created around them. They remembered the smells of food cooking, the sound of dishes being washed, and the comfort of familiar routines. Memory has a way of preserving these small details long after larger events have faded. This is why historians increasingly value personal memories alongside official records. They help reveal how people actually experience the world around them. Another fascinating aspect of the era was the balance between stability and change. On the surface, life often appeared predictable. Families followed routines, neighbourhoods remained familiar, and social expectations seemed well established. Yet, beneath this appearance of stability, powerful changes were already taking place. New technologies, economic growth, and shifting cultural attitudes were quietly transforming society. Many people did not fully realize how much the world would change. Over the following decades, what seemed permanent in 1955 would often look completely different by 1975. The women standing in those kitchens were living through a transitional moment in history, even if they did not always recognize it at the time. They carried traditions from earlier generations, while preparing children for a future that would be very different from their own past. This position between old and new gave their experiences a unique significance. They served as a bridge between eras. Back, we can see how their daily efforts contributed to both continuity and change. They preserved family customs, while helping raise a generation that would challenge many existing assumptions. Few people have such an important role in history, yet most performed it quietly and without recognition. Their lives remind us that history is often shaped not only by dramatic events, but also by ordinary individuals, carrying out everyday responsibilities with patience, determination, and care. Perhaps the greatest lesson from this story is that ordinary life is never truly ordinary. When people think about history, they often imagine kings, presidents, wars, and famous speeches. Yet most people who have ever lived were not rulers or celebrities. They were parents, workers, neighbours, friends, and family members. Their lives may not have appeared dramatic, but together they created the foundation upon which every society was built. The women who spent their days in 1950s kitchens belong to this larger story. They were part of a generation that helped shape modern America through countless small actions repeated every single day. A meal prepared for a hungry family. A child comforted after a difficult day at school. A carefully managed household budget. Or a tradition preserved for future generations may not seem historic in the moment. Yet when multiplied across millions of homes, these actions influenced an entire nation. This perspective changes the way we think about the past. instead of focusing only on extraordinary events. We begin to appreciate the importance of everyday experiences. We see that history is not something that happens only in government, buildings, or on battlefields. It also happens in kitchens, living rooms, classrooms, and neighbourhoods. It happens wherever people make choices, solve problems, and care for one another. The 1950s housewife represents this idea perfectly. Her work was often invisible, yet its effects were visible everywhere. Families depended on it. Communities depended on it. Future generations benefited from it. At the same time, her story reminds us that every era has limitations. The expectations placed upon women during this period reflected the values of the time, but they did not always allow individuals the freedom to pursue every opportunity available to them. Understanding this helps us appreciate both the strengths and weaknesses of the past. We can admire the resilience, dedication, and resourcefulness of these women while also recognizing the challenges they faced. History becomes richer when we acknowledge both sides of the story. Real life is rarely simple, and neither is the past. As we continue exploring the world of 1950s America, we discover that behind every polished advertisement and every carefully staged photograph were real human beings living complicated lives. They experienced success and disappointment, confidence and uncertainty, joy and frustration. Their experiences may belong to another era, but their emotions remain familiar. That connection across time is what makes history so fascinating. The more closely we examine the lives of ordinary people, the more we realize that the past is not as distant as it first appears. In many ways, their hopes, fears, and dreams were not so different from our own. And if there is one final thing that makes the story of the 1950s housewife worth remembering, it is the reminder that progress and tradition often exist together. The women of this era lived at a crossroads between the past and the future. They inherited customs from earlier generations while witnessing the arrival of a rapidly modernizing world. Refrigerators replaced iceboxes. Television entered living rooms. Supermarkets expanded. New products promise convenience and efficiency. Yet despite all these innovations, many of the most important parts of life remained unchanged. Families still gathered together. Parents still worried about their children's future. People still searched for happiness, security, and purpose. Technology changed the tools people used, but it did not change the fundamental human desire to care for loved ones and create a meaningful life. This balance between change and continuity is one of the reasons the 1950s remain such a fascinating period. Looking back, it is tempting to view the decade through nostalgia or criticism alone. But history is rarely that simple. The reality was more complicated and therefore more interesting. There were opportunities that many people valued and limitations that many people struggled against. There was comfort and pressure, stability and uncertainty, satisfaction and frustration. All of these realities existed at the same time. The women who lived through this era navigated these complexities every day. Some found deep fulfillment in family life. Others dreamed of possibilities beyond the home. Most experienced a combination of both. Their lives remind us that human experiences cannot easily be reduced to simple categories. Every person carries a unique story shaped by circumstances, choices, and personal aspirations. This is why historians continue returning to the experiences of ordinary people. Through their stories, we gain a more complete understanding of the past. We move beyond statistics and headlines and encounter real human lives. The kitchen of the 1950s becomes more than a room filled with appliances and cookware. It becomes a place where decisions were made. Relationships were strengthened, traditions were preserved, and futures were quietly shaped. Children who sat around those tables eventually grew up and helped transform society in ways their parents could never have predicted. The influence of those homes extended far beyond their walls. In our Zenze, the story of the American housewife is also the story of modern America itself. It reflects changing ideas about family, work, gender, technology, and opportunity. By understanding these women, we better understand the world they helped create. And as we continue drifting through the quiet history of another era, we are reminded that even the most ordinary lives can leave an extraordinary legacy. One that continues to echo across generations long after the dishes have been washed, the lights have been turned off, and the kitchen has finally fallen silent. Over the years, many of these women watched their children leave home and begin families of their own. The busy kitchens that had once been filled with noise gradually became quieter. Toys disappeared from living rooms. School schedules no longer filled calendars. The routines that had structured daily life for decades slowly changed. For some women, this transition brought a sense of freedom. For others, it brought unexpected loneliness. Much of their identity had been connected to caring for family members, and adjusting to a new stage of life was not always easy. Yet, even as households changed, the influence of these women remained visible. Their children carried memories, values, and habits into adulthood. Family traditions continued because someone had taken the time to preserve them. Favourite recipes survived because someone had written them down and shared them with the next generation. The impact of a lifetime spent caring for others often became most apparent only years later. This is one of the quiet truths of history. Some contributions are not immediately visible. Their effects appear gradually across decades. Looking back now, it is remarkable how many aspects of modern life were shaped by people who never considered themselves historically important. The average housewife of the 1950s probably never imagined that future historians would study her daily routines, was focused on practical concerns like dinner, paying bills, cleaning the house, and helping her family. Yet these everyday activities reveal valuable information about an entire era. They help us understand what people valued, how communities functioned, and what daily life actually felt like. Without these stories, our understanding of history would be incomplete. We would know about major events, but not about the people who lived through them. The story of the 1950s kitchen, therefore, serves as a reminder that ordinary lives matter. They matter not because they are dramatic, but because they are real. They show how people adapted to challenges, built relationships, and found meaning in everyday responsibilities. These experiences connect generations across time. a parent worrying about a child's future in 1955 was not so different from a parent worrying about a child's future today. A family gathering around a dinner table to share stories remains a familiar experience even in a very different world. Human nature changes far more slowly than technology or fashion. That is why these stories continue to resonate. They remind us that beneath the surface differences of every era, people are often driven by the same hopes and concerns. The details may change, but the desire to care for loved ones, build a secure life, and create lasting memories remains remarkably constant throughout history. And perhaps nowhere was that timeless human desire more visible than in the kitchens where millions of women quietly devoted themselves to the people they loved. As time passed, many of Wenschkitchen appeared. Houses were renovated, appliances were replaced, and decorating styles changed with each new decade. Yet the memories connected to those spaces often remained stronger than the physical rooms themselves. Ask someone who grew up in the 1950 Sekunde, and they might not remember every detail of a political event or a newspaper headline, but they often remember the smell of dinner cooking after school, the sound of a mixer running on a weekend afternoon, or the sight of family members gathered around the table at the end of the day. Memory has a way of preserving the moments that felt personal and meaningful. This is why historians increasingly recognise the importance of daily life. Large historical events help explain what happened, but ordinary experiences help explain how people felt while it was happening. The women who spent their days managing households were witnesses to enormous social changes. They lived through economic growth, technological innovation, cultural transformation, and shifting expectations about family and work. Yet most experienced these changes not through grand speeches or political debates, but through the routines of everyday life. A new appliance arriving in the kitchen, a different recipe appearing in a magazine, or a child bringing home new ideas from school could reflect larger changes occurring across the nation. In this way, the kitchen became connected to the wider world. It was not isolated from history. It was one of the places where history was experienced most directly. Every generation leaves behind traces of itself. Some leave monuments, books, or inventions. Others leave traditions, memories, and values. The women of the 1950s left all of these things in different ways. Their influence can still be found in family customs, community traditions, and cultural expectations that survived long after the decade ended, even today. Many people continue using recipes, celebrations, and household habits that originated during that period. The legacy of these women, therefore, extends far beyond their own lifetimes. It lives on through the people they taught, the families they supported, and the communities they helped build. Looking back across the decades, it becomes clear that the story of the American housewife is not merely about domestic life. It is about the quiet power of consistency, responsibility, and care. It is about individuals who rarely appeared in history books, but whose efforts shaped the lives of millions. Their achievements were often measured not in public recognition, but in the strength of the families and communities they helped create. And while the world around them changed in ways they could never have predicted, the values that motivated many of them, love, dedication, sacrifice, and hope for a better future, remain just as recognizable today as they were in the bright kitchens of 1950 Sekunde America. As we continue reflecting on this era, it becomes clear that one of the most remarkable things about the women of the 1950s was their ability to find meaning in routines that might appear ordinary from the outside. Day after day, many followed similar schedules. Breakfast had to be prepared, children needed attention, shopping had to be completed, and dinner had to be ready before evening. To an outside aperitif. Yet within those routines existed countless opportunities to care for others, solve problems, and create a sense of stability. A well-prepared meal could comfort a family after a difficult day. A clean and organised home could provide peace during stressful times. Small acts of care often had a larger impact than anyone realised. These contributions rarely appeared in newspapers, but they mattered deeply to the people who experienced them. Another important aspect of the period was the strong connection between homemaking and identity. Society often encouraged women to judge their success according to the condition of their homes. If the house was clean, the children were healthy, and meals were prepared on time, a woman was considered successful. If problems appeared in any of these areas, many felt personally responsible. This connection between self-worth and household performance created both pride and pressure. It motivated some women to develop extraordinary skills, while causing others to feel that they could never do enough. Looking back now, we can see that these expectations were often unrealistic. No one can maintain perfection every day. Yet the desire to meet these standards shaped the experiences of millions. At the same time, it is important to remember that these women were not merely responding to expectations. They were also shaping the culture around them through conversations with neighbours, participation in local organisations, involvement in schools, and influence within families. They played an active role in community life. Their opinions mattered. Their decisions mattered. The values they taught often remained with their children for decades. In this way, their influence extended far beyond the walls of the home. Historians sometimes describe this as invisible power, the ability to shape society without holding formal positions of authority. The women of the 1950s exercised this kind of influence every day. They helped define social norms, preserve traditions, and guide future generations. Their contributions may not always have been publicly recognised, but they were undeniably significant. As we look back across the years, we begin to understand that history is not only created by those who stand in front of crowds or appear in textbooks. It is also created by those who quietly perform responsibilities, nurture relationships, and support the people around them. The kitchens of 1950s America were filled with such individuals, and their stories continue to offer valuable insights into the complex relationship between family, society, and the everyday experiences that shape human life. Perhaps the most enduring part of this story is the fact that so much of it was never intended to be remembered. The women who spent their days cooking meals, washing dishes, balancing budgets, and caring for children were usually focused on the present, not on creating a historical legacy. They were thinking about tomorrow's grocery list, next week's school event, or how to make a limited paycheck last until the end of the month. Yet history is often built from exactly these kinds of ordinary concerns. When millions of people share similar experiences, those experiences become part of a larger national story. The kitchens of the 1950s were connected by common expectations, common routines, and common dreams. Families across the country may have lived in different towns and different neighbourhoods, but many shared similar ideas about what a successful life should look like. They valued hard work, responsibility, family loyalty, and stability. These values shaped daily decisions and influenced the way children were raised. As those children grew up, they carried many of these lessons into a changing world. Some embraced them completely. Others questioned them. Most combined old traditions with new ideas. In this way, the influence of the 1950s continued long after the decade itself had ended. It became part of the foundation upon which later generations built their lives. This process is one of the most fascinating aspects of history. Every generation inherits something from those who came before. Sometimes those inheritances are physical objects, such as family photographs, recipes, or homes. Other times they are less visible beliefs, habits, values, and expectations. The women of the 1950s passed down both kinds of legacies. Their influence survived not because they sought recognition, but because they invested time and effort into the people around them. Looking at their lives today, we can appreciate how much determination was required to maintain households during an era of high expectations. We can recognise the challenges they faced, while also acknowledging the achievements they accomplished. Most importantly, we can see them as individuals rather than stereotypes. They were not simply symbols of a decade. They were daughters, wives, mothers, friends, neighbours, and community members. Each had a unique story shaped by personal circumstances and choices. Together, those stories form a rich and complex picture of everyday life in mid-century America. The more closely we examine these experiences, the more we understand that history is not merely a collection of famous events. It is a record of human lives. And among those lives are countless women whose work was often quiet, often overlooked, but never unimportant. Their efforts helped shape families, communities, and future generations, leaving behind a legacy far more significant than they may ever have realised. As we near the end of this long journey through the kitchens of 1950s America, it is worth pausing to consider how differently future generations may view our own lives, just as we look back at the rules, expectations, and daily routines of the past with curiosity. People decades from now may look back at us in much the same way. They may be surprised by the technologies we use, the pressures we face, and the ways we organise our lives. History has a way of turning everyday experiences into fascinating stories. The women of the 1950s could never have known that future. Generations would study their kitchens, their recipes, and their routines. To them, these things were simply normal life. Yet normal life is exactly what historians seek to understand. It reveals what people valued, what they feared, what they hoped for, and how they adapted to change. The story of the American housewife provides a perfect example of this. Through her experiences, we gain insight into an entire era. We learn about family structures, economic conditions, social expectations, consumer culture, and community life. We see how national trends influence personal decisions and how personal decisions, in turn, helped shape society. The relationship between individual lives and larger historical forces becomes visible in a way that statistics alone can never capture. This is why personal stories remain so important. They remind us that history is ultimately about people. Behind every decade are millions of individuals, living ordinary lives filled with challenges, successes, disappointments, and dreams. The women who spent their days in 1950s kitchens were no exception. They laughed with friends, worried about the future, celebrated holidays, solved problems, and cared deeply about the people around them. Their lives were rich, complicated, and uniquely human. The more closely we examine them, the more we recognize familiar emotions that continue to shape our own world today. Love for family, concern for children, pride in meaningful work, and hope for a better future are not limited to any single generation. They connect people across time. That connection is one of the greatest gifts history offers. It allows us to see ourselves in those who lived before us and to understand that, despite changing technology and social norms, many aspects of the human experience remain remarkably consistent. The kitchens of the 1950s may belong to the past, but the people who stood within them still have something valuable to teach us. Their story reminds us that even the quietest lives can leave lasting marks on the world, often in ways that are not fully understood until many years later. Yet there is another reason this story continues to matter. It reminds us that every generation believes its way of life is normal, even when future generations may see it very differently. In the 1950s, many people assumed that the social rules of their time would last forever. The idea of the full-time housewife seemed natural to millions of Americans. Magazines, advertisements, schools, and even government policies often reinforced this image. Few people imagined how quickly these assumptions would change. Within only a few decades, opportunities expanded, expectations shifted, and family structures became far more diverse. What once seemed permanent became part of history. This pattern has repeated throughout human history. Every era creates traditions that feel unshakable, only for later generations to reshape them in unexpected ways. The women of the 1950s lived through one of these transitional moments. They inherited customs from the past while unknowingly helping prepare society for the future. Many raised children who would grow up questioning long-standing social expectations. Others adapted to changing circumstances themselves, pursuing new interests, careers, and opportunities later in life. Their ability to adjust demonstrates an important truth about human nature. People are often far more adaptable than they realize. Even when the world changes rapidly, individuals find ways to learn, grow, and move forward. The story of the American housewife, therefore, becomes more than a story about domestic life. It becomes a story about resilience in the face of change. It shows how ordinary people respond when traditions evolve and expectations shift. Some changes are welcomed, Others are difficult. Yet life continues, and each generation finds its own path. Looking back across the decades, we can see how much courage and persistence everyday life sometimes requires. Maintaining a household, raising children, managing finances, and supporting family members may not attract public attention. But these responsibilities demand dedication and strength. The women who carried them out every day deserve to be remembered, not because they were perfect, but because they were human. They faced challenges, made mistakes, solved problems, and kept moving forward. Their lives were filled with the same mixture of hope and uncertainty that characterizes every generation. This is why their story remains relevant. It reminds us that history is not simply a collection of dates and events. It is a collection of human experiences. The people of the past were not characters in a storybook. They were individuals living real lives, making decisions without knowing how the future would unfold. And in that uncertainty, they were not so different from us. Their world may have looked different, but their hopes, fears, responsibilities, and dreams remain surprisingly familiar even today. One of the most valuable things we gain from studying the past is perspective. When we examine the lives of the women who spent their days in 1950s kitchens, we begin to understand how deeply society can influence personal choices. Many of the expectations these women faced were so common that they rarely seemed unusual at the time. Neighbours followed similar routines. Friends received similar advice. Magazines promoted similar ideals. Because these messages appeared everywhere, they often felt like simple facts of life rather than cultural expectations. Yet history teaches us that many things people consider normal are actually shaped by their specific time and place in which they live. This realization encourages us to think more carefully about our own assumptions. What do we accept today that future generations might question? Which of our current habits and beliefs will seem unusual decades from now? The people of the 1950s could not answer those questions about their own era, just as we cannot fully answer them about ours. That uncertainty is part of what makes history so fascinating. It reminds us that every generation is living through changes that may only become obvious in hindsight. The women of the 1950s did not know they were participating in a chapter of history that would later be studied in classrooms, documentaries, and books. They were simply trying to live good lives according to the standards and opportunities available to them. In doing so, they left behind a remarkable record of everyday human experience. Through their stories, we learn about responsibility, sacrifice, adaptation, and perseverance. We learn how people create meaning through family relationships and community connections. We learn that even seemingly ordinary routines can reveal important truths about an entire society. Perhaps most importantly, we learn that history is not only about famous individuals. It is also about the countless people whose names may never appear in textbooks, but whose actions helped shape the world around them. Every clean kitchen, every family dinner, every carefully planned budget, and every lesson passed from parent to child contributed to a larger story. Those small actions accumulated over years and decades, influencing future generations in ways that could never be fully measured. The women at the centre of this story may not have considered themselves historical figures, but their experiences remain an important part of understanding the 20th century. Their lives offer a window into a world that was both familiar and different, comforting and challenging, simple and complex. And as we continue exploring the quiet corners of history, we are reminded once again that some of the most meaningful stories are found not in extraordinary events, but in the everyday lives of ordinary people who quietly helped shape the future. By now, it may be tempting to think of the 1950s housewife as a symbol rather than a person, but symbols can sometimes hide the complexity of real lives. Behind every photograph of a smiling woman standing in a spotless kitchen was an individual with her own personality, ambitions, worries, and experiences. Some women loved homemaking and found deep satisfaction in creating comfortable homes for their families. Others felt restricted by the expectations placed upon them. Many experienced both feelings at different times throughout their lives. Human beings are rarely defined by a single role, and the women of the 1950s were no exception. They were daughters, sisters, wives, mothers, friends, volunteers, community members, and often much more. Their identities extended beyond the walls of their kitchens, even when society sometimes encouraged them to focus primarily on domestic responsibilities. Understanding this complexity helps us avoid oversimplifying the past. History is most accurate when it acknowledges that different people can experience the same era in very different ways. A suburban homemaker in one part of the country may have lived a life completely different from a woman in a rural town or a crowded city neighbourhood. Economic circumstances, education, family background, and personal goals all influenced individual experiences. This diversity reminds us that no historical period can be reduced to a single story. Instead, history is a collection of many stories woven together. The image of the perfect 1950s housewife became famous because it appeared in advertisements, television programs, and magazines. Yet real life was always more complicated than the image itself. Families faced unexpected problems. Financial difficulties appeared. Relationships encountered challenges. Children made mistakes. Illnesses occurred. The ordinary realities of life continued regardless of how perfect a home appeared from the outside. Despite these difficulties, people adapted and carried on. That ability to persevere through everyday challenges is one of the most universal aspects of human history. Whether in the 1950s or today, people continue finding ways to overcome obstacles, support loved ones, and build meaningful lives. The women of this era demonstrated that resilience every day. Their efforts may not have attracted public attention, but they helped create stability during a period of rapid change. Looking back now, we can appreciate not only what these women accomplished, but also what their experiences teach us about human nature itself. Their story reminds us that behind every historical era are real people living complicated lives. They laughed, worried, dreamed, struggled, succeeded, and hoped just as we do today. And it is through understanding those ordinary, human experiences that the past becomes truly alive. As we follow these lives toward their final chapters, we begin to see that the true story of the 1950s housewife is not about perfection at all. It is about effort. Advertisements promised perfect homes, perfect meals, and perfect families. But real life rarely follows such neat patterns. What truly held families together was not perfection, but persistence. Day after day, women continued showing up for the people who depended on them. They prepared meals even when they were tired. They solved problems even when they felt overwhelmed. They found ways to keep moving forward through challenges that often went unnoticed by the outside world. This quiet persistence became one of the defining characteristics of the era. Many women developed a remarkable ability to adapt. When money was tight, they found creative ways to stretch household budgets. When unexpected guests arrived, they improvised meals and accommodations. When family members faced difficulties, they provided support and encouragement. These skills were learned through experience rather than formal training. Over time, countless women became experts in managing the complexities of everyday life. Yet, because this work occurred inside the home, it was often underestimated. Modern historians increasingly recognize that maintaining a household required organization, planning, communication, and problem-solving skills that were far more demanding than many people realized. The home functioned almost like a small institution, and the woman responsible for managing it often carried a tremendous amount of responsibility. At the same time, family life provided rewards that many women valued deeply. Watching children grow, celebrating milestones, sharing traditions, and creating memories brought meaning to daily routines. These moments helped balance some of the pressures associated with homemaking. A birthday celebration, a holiday gathering, or a simple evening spent together around the dinner table could transform ordinary days into lasting memories. Such experiences remind us that history is not only about challenges. It is also about joy, connection, and the relationships that give life purpose. Looking back across the decades, it becomes clear that the kitchens of the 1950s were places where countless human stories unfolded. Some were happy, some were difficult, and most were a mixture of both. Families celebrated successes, faced disappointments, and adapted to changing circumstances. Through it all, ordinary people continued building lives one day at a time. This is perhaps the most universal lesson of the entire story. No matter the era, most people spend their lives navigating ordinary responsibilities while hoping for a better future. The women of the 1950s were doing exactly that. Their world may seem distant now, but their experiences remain deeply human. And because of that, their story continues to resonate long after the kitchens, advertisements, and social expectations of their era have faded into history. And so, as the lights in these imagined 1950s kitchens begin to dim and the sounds of another busy day slowly fade away, we arrive at the end of our journey. What started as a story about cooking, cleaning, and household rules has revealed something much deeper. It has shown us the lives of millions of women whose work quietly shaped families, communities, and future generations. Their names may never appear in history books, and their photographs may sit unnoticed in old family albums. But their influence remains woven into the fabric of everyday life. They taught lessons, preserved traditions, offered comfort during difficult times, and created homes where children could grow and dream about the future. Those contributions were not always celebrated, yet they mattered enormously. The world around them changed in ways they could never have imagined. New technologies appeared. Social expectations evolved. Opportunities expanded. Entire ways of life transformed within a single lifetime. Yet through all of these changes, certain things remained constant. People still longed for connection. Families still gathered together. Parents still hoped to give their children better lives than they had known themselves. These simple human desires linked the women of the 1950s to every generation that came before and every generation that followed. Their kitchens may now belong to history, but the emotions, hopes, and challenges they experienced continue to feel familiar. Perhaps that is the greatest lesson this story leaves behind. History is not only found in famous events or powerful leaders. It is also found in ordinary people, carrying out ordinary responsibilities with extraordinary dedication. The women who spent their days preparing meals, balancing budgets, washing dishes, and caring for loved ones helped build the foundations of modern life in ways that often went unnoticed. Their efforts remind us that some of the most important work in the world happens quietly, far from public attention, one small act of care at a time. And now, as the evening grows still and the last dishes have been put away, imagine one final scene. A family home sits peacefully beneath the fading glow of a suburban sunset. The kitchen is clean, the day's work is finished, and the voices that once filled the room have fallen silent. Yet the memories remain. They linger in old recipes, family traditions, faded photographs, and stories passed from one generation to the next, long after the decade itself has disappeared. Those memories continue to connect the past with the present. Thank you for joining me on this gentle journey through the kitchens of 1950s America. I hope you enjoyed exploring the lives, challenges, and traditions of the women who quietly shaped an era. As you settle in and let your thoughts drift, remember that history is all around us, hidden in the everyday moments that seem ordinary at the time but become extraordinary with the passing of years. Until our next journey into the past, sleep well, dream peacefully, and let the echoes of history carry you softly into the night. Good night.